This presentation is brought to you by the West Virginia Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. The Behavior and Mental Health Technical Assistance Center is made possible through a collaboration between the West Virginia Autism Training Center at Marshall University and the West Virginia Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Student Support. The following presentation, titled Leading in Challenging Times, Supporting Staff and Students During Reentry, was recorded on August 13th, 2020. The presenter is Dr. Jim Harris, Associate Director of the West Virginia Autism Training Center at Marshall University.
So we're very, very pleased this morning to have Dr. Jim Harris. He's the Associate Director for the West Virginia Autism Training Center at Marshall University. I know a lot of you heard him speak earlier this summer when the State Department had him on. If you've been to trainings and so forth, he's done a lot of speaking engagements at those trainings. So he's wonderful. And today he's going to talk about leading in challenging times. So, Dr. Harris, without further ado, are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Let's roll.
Let's go.
Just want to double check. You still see just one slide there, Christine?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay.
And we can hear you great too.
Oh, awesome. Good. Yeah. My voice usually carries pretty well, so we'll be in good shape.
Perfect.
Good morning, gang. I tell you, I wish I could be there in person, but as we know, that presents its challenges these days. I really appreciate Christina working with me to get this squared away. Her and Kathy really worked hard to make sure that, despite the challenges, that we made this happen. So I'm excited to be talking with you today. Excited to be, I feel like in the world of behavior support, which is where I do a lot of my work, this is kind of game time for folks like me to support schools, to support leaders. And a time where it's unprecedented, obviously. We could argue that education hasn't seen anything like this since probably the Depression or World War II when it comes to disruption and what that disruption looks like. And the nature of disruption now is even different because of community context. So I'm happy to be working alongside of school leaders to do the best we can with what we know. And it's one of the things that I just have a huge amount of respect for the tough decisions that academic leadership, educational leadership have had to make, because you're having to make tough decisions with the information you have, but not all the information you need, because we don't know everything we need to know. And that, to me, is what makes this so challenging. The example I gave, and I'm not trying to minimize the significance of any kind of natural disaster, but when a hurricane comes through and it's over, the hurricane's over, and you can go to work on rebuilding and go to work on organizing, prioritizing, those kinds of things. And the challenge we're in right now is it's almost like we're trying to rebuild the city while the hurricane's still going on. And that presents its own level of challenges. But, there's at some point we have to move forward. We have to have action. So I hope today my goal is to give you some ideas of what might be some actions to consider as first things first, what might be some psychology to consider as you approach those actions, and hopefully give you some things to think about. Of course, as you know, I don't have this figured out because I've never been through this either. All I'm doing is I'm going to borrow from what I've learned from behavior support, what I've learned from psychology, trauma, and those kinds of things, and try to apply them or generalize them to the situation that we find ourselves in today. I'll speak for probably, give or take, around 90 minutes. And then at the end of that 90 minutes, it'd be fantastic if we had some time to kind of dialogue, talk amongst ourselves. And if there's questions that I can answer, I'm happy to answer questions. But maybe there's some content that kind of got the wheels turning for you, and we can use that as a time to dialogue a little bit more. So I'll first kind of give you a sense. As Christina mentioned, I am the Associate Director of the Autism Training Center at Marshall University. Tell you a little bit about the Autism Training Center. We actually have three distinct departments. The Autism Training Center has been in existence since the mid 80s, but has evolved significantly, obviously, since then. We have three main departments. Our first department, which is our oldest department, which some folks may have had contact with. I know we've had some staff come into Braxton and do some support for some of your students with autism. Is our direct service department. Our direct service department provides direct services in a variety of fashions to a multi-tiered system, everything from ID cards to a lending library to coaching sessions, parent cohorts, all the way to individualized supports to families. And it's really evolved significantly through the years to be a much more comprehensive program. And we're really, really proud of where that department is now. Our second department is our college program, which some of you may have heard of. We have a college program here on Marshall University's campus where we support individuals diagnosed with autism who are degree-seeking students here at Marshall University. They're admitted like any other student. They meet the academic requirements, but they also, to qualify for our program, have to have a clinical diagnosis of autism. And we provide, our program provides supports to help them navigate the higher education environment, taking into consideration the challenges that autism presents for them. And a lot of things we do a lot of work with are social skills, organization, anxiety, a lot of the things, those of you who work with students with autism, that we can have. We have a lot of young people with autism that are unbelievably academically capable, but it's the social, emotional, and communication things that can sometimes get in their way from reaching their fullest potential. And our job is to help to build the capacity of those students and help them obtain their degree and then meaningfully engage in society. Our last department, which is the department I'm representing directly today, is our Behavior and Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. The Behavior and Mental Health Technical Assistance Center was created through a partnership with the Autism Training Center and the West Virginia Department of Education, specifically the Office of Special Education. They grant us money to implement a number of projects. The main projects being our school-wide positive behavior support project, which is headed up by Alicia Zeman, our early childhood positive behavior support project, which is headed up by Dr. Amy Carlson, and our mental health first aid project, which is headed up by Diana Bailey Miller. The director of our Behavior and Mental Health Technical Assistance Center is Amy Kelly. We do a lot of things in that Technical Assistance Center, but our main goal is to build capacity in counties and schools to help them to provide better behavior and mental health supports for their students. We do a lot of training on things like trauma, classroom management, school-wide implementation, self-care. So we're really, really proud of what that Technical Assistance Center has become and will continue to become. And that's who I represent more directly today because of the nature of the content. So before we go into strategies about how to lead in this unprecedented time, and what I'm going to talk a lot about is, what's reentry? When we look at reentry, and I understand we got some hybrid models, we've got completely virtual models, and it's almost impossible to give you strategies that span across all those equally, because the virtual environment has its own context and its own variables. The hybrid model, of course, being a blend of both, and then the in-person model having the more traditional strategies or traditional context for strategies to be applied. So I'm talking more about reentry because I know that you guys are looking at reentry for some of your students, and you have some of your students choosing a virtual option as well. So we'll talk about those things, and you're going to have to bend and manipulate the content in some instances to fit different contexts. But the first thing I always think is important is, before we ever get into strategies, and I've learned this just with behavior support work, before we ever get into strategies, the first place we have to start is understanding that there are things that, regardless of the validity or the effectiveness from an academic sense of a strategy, if you don't consider some other things first, the strategy can ultimately not be effective. And there's three elements of that. The first one is state. State is, what is the psychological and physiological state or condition that a person is engaging the problem, that the person is in while they're engaging the problem. So let me give you an example. Let's say I go into a classroom and I've got a teacher who has a child with some behavioral issues, and I'm going to do an observation. And if I just write a bunch of strategies and hand them to the teacher and say, here's the strategies you need to do, and that's all I do. Here's your strategies. Here's your prescription for the problem. But if I don't know or if we don't take into consideration, and it doesn't mean I can fix this, it impacts the level of effectiveness of the strategies. Let's say that teacher, though, is taking care of her elderly father who has dementia, and she's not sleeping much. And after she finishes work, she goes and takes care of him, and then she goes to bed. She gets up and she comes to work. That's why at the TA Center we're spending a lot of time talking about self-care. In fact, I just did a presentation yesterday about self-care, because we do have to consider the state that educators are engaging in the profession of education that they're currently in. Now, this is one of the tough things, and I'll just be very blunt about this. I had a gentleman ask me yesterday, but what about, he listed all the health problems that he has and all these very serious stressors he has in his life about going back to school. And I said, and I want to be clear that it would be reckless of me to try to participate in a very personal decision that you have to make. Everybody right now has to make some very personal decisions that have to do with their personal variables. And then those personal decisions will then translate into their professional status. So I think there's a lot of the state stuff right now that is difficult. And I know from a leadership standpoint is difficult about what places do you have a say and what places do you not have a say in the decisions that people are making, but state matters. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we can help people process in an effective way without trying to be a therapist for people as we look at reentry. The second part of what makes a strategy that can help make a strategy work or work against a strategy is what is the story that a person's telling themselves about the problem. So when they engage the problem, what's the story they're telling themselves? Let's say I'm in another classroom and I do an observation and I have a little guy, let's say with autism, and I notice that he's pretty verbal, pretty academically capable, but he's really anxious kid, struggles with transitions, those kinds of things. Those are struggling. Well, he's anxious, he struggles with transitions. I'm going to work on building up predictability strategies for him, visual schedules, first then, things like that, cueing, these kinds of things. But let's say by chance that teacher doesn't believe this kid really has autism. They just think, well, what's wrong with this kid is he doesn't like to be told no, and he doesn't like to be told he has to stop doing something, and people spoil him, and that's what's wrong with him. If that's the story that teachers telling themselves, and I give strategies like first then, visual schedule, things like that, they're much less likely to use those strategies because of the story they're telling themselves. So I don't have a lot of time to unpack those two things, but I do think it's important to consider state that your teachers are entering into the building. Consider that. Think about that. Try to better understand that. What's the story they're telling themselves about reentry? And you'll help them in hopefully when people make the decision, I'll talk about this later, when people make the decision to return, I think you make the decision to return. You're in. You're not in and out, because that creates anxiety for everybody, including children. So once we're in, then we start working on our collective narrative as a building on what's the story we're telling ourselves about reentry. And that's what good leaders do, is they help build a narrative for their team, which a lot of times is often talked about in vision too, but they build a narrative for what we're going to do. And then once the narrative's in place, now we start talking about strategies. So we know our state's in a good place, our story matches, and then our strategies match. And there's a synergy that can occur if we are mindful of those things. If you just walk in and slap a big page paper on the table and says, this is what we're going to do, I venture to say your implementation will be lacking in spirit and in effectiveness. The story thing that I always talk about when we're talking about behavior support, and this is one of those that I just want us to think about the reframe. So for a story, we look at, one of the things that I've found sometimes when there is a lot of discord with kids in buildings is the mentality in which people are approaching behavior support. So if you're approaching behavior support from a perspective of what's wrong with kids these days, you have immediately created a dichotomy of conflict. And what that means is, think of it this way. If you came home from work and your significant other looked at you and said, I've been thinking about it all day today, and I've figured out what's wrong with you. And think about the emotional reaction you would have to such a statement. Because immediately what you're going to do is you're going to go into defending yourself, because someone is getting ready to tell you what's wrong with you. So now you feel you have to emotionally defend yourself. I doubt anybody here would say, You know what? Let me get a coffee and I'll come back and you can tell me about all the ways I'm failing as a human. It's just not our nature. So when we say, you know what's wrong with kids these days, what we are doing is approaching young people as broken and flawed. And that is never a context where people want to improve or grow. So the reframe that I'm always trying to get people to focus on, and this actually is a very unifying perspective, because this works for even when you have people who can sometimes be overindulgent to children versus, and even people who can be too hard on children. This is a narrative sometimes, or a story that can sometimes pull them together, which is what kids need these days. Because oftentimes when people are either overindulgent or too hard on kids, it's the fact that they're not being really thoughtful about what I've talked about, it, which is this is, what's the goal? And this is the rallying point for no matter if we're pandemic or no pandemic. The rallying point is, what are we trying to do with schools? What are we trying to do as parents? I got a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old at the house. What are we trying to do as parents? And I'll tell you a quick funny story. My 13-year-old was sitting on the couch and he was asking me if he could do something, and I said no. And he looks at me and he says, "You're mean," like every 13-year-old probably does to the parent. And I started laughing. I was joking with him, and I started laughing, and I said, "Well, son, you seem to be confused." And he kind of looks at me kind of funny, and I said, "You seem to think that my goal is to raise happy kids." And he looks at me kind of like turns his head, and he yells into his mom, which my wife is a principal of an elementary school. And he yells into my wife and says, "Dad doesn't want us to have a happy childhood." And my wife yells in, "Me neither." And joking, of course. But I said, "No, man, here's the deal. My goal in parenting is not to raise a happy 13-year-old. It's to raise a functional 30-year-old. I want a functional adult. Like, that's my goal. I want a functional adult. Now, I want my kids to be happy as much as anybody else wants their kids to be happy. But my goal is capacity building. My goal is to give my kids experiences that will make them ready to engage the world meaningfully. Because I know that that's what real happiness is for a human person, is to be able to engage society with competence. And so that's really still our goal. Pandemic or no pandemic, we're trying to help young people be effective adults. So we can all kind of rally around that and get back to a very basic concept that kind of builds in. All right, we know how to do this thing. It just so happens, that a few of the variables have changed. Now, one of the things though we have to do though, and we know this, but we understand that traumatized and stressed brains function differently, and the level of stress and the likelihood of trauma is greater now than it would be last fall. And understanding that there's going to be nuance in the approach that we have to take. Now, so what we need to do is, in order to connect, we have to understand. My two core values in work are compassion and growth. So everything I'm trying to do, not work, life, my two main things are compassion and growth. So compassion is trying to better understand how a person experiences the world, and growth, though, is asking more of them in order to develop into who they're capable of becoming. If you're too compassionate with people, you make them weak. If you ask too much of them or ask for too much growth or beyond their scope, you break them. So there's always this balancing act that we're always doing with working with people, period, even ourselves, where we're trying to balance the compassion of understanding and the demand of growth. So the first place we do have to start with our kids and our staff is the compassion of understanding. And part of that compassion of understanding is understanding that stress and traumatized brains function differently. And if we unpack the idea of what stress is, the first place you start, as we go back to freshman biology, is the idea that a stressor is anything that disrupts homeostasis. Homeostasis is balance. So stress is anything that knocks off the balance, and that can be good things or it can be bad things. If we talk specifically about what negative stressors are, and we unpack some of those variables, it's those things that cause a physiological response. It's perceived as aversive. And the last one's really, really critical, is the person doesn't feel control. So let me give you a couple examples real quickly. Like a treadmill, for example. It causes a physiological response. It can be perceived as aversive. I mean, people, that's why we hang clothes on them, to hide them from ourselves. Do we have control, though? Yes, we have 100% control of whether you get on it, how fast it goes, those kinds of things. There's even some, like tricky ones. For example, this example I use is a tricky one. you get on a roller coaster. A roller coaster does cause a physiological response. It can be perceived as aversive. And when I ask people about control, a lot of people go, huh, and you get mixed answers in a crowd. Well, the question is, you have control over whether you get on it. And part of the getting on it and giving our control away is where, as humans, sometimes we get a kick out of that. You know, it's fun for us. That we love when we get on that roller coaster to look at that guy and say, yes, well-tattooed gentleman, I trust you. There's something about giving away control sometimes on purpose that feels fun to us. But the other side of it, a very serious example, let's take, for example, a kid who's being physically abused. Does cause a physiological response. It is perceived as aversive, but they don't have control. So when you start to analyze stress, and one of my main things, I used to be a therapist before, and one of the things that I would try to help people do is unpack stress, demystify stress, because a lot of people say, I'm stressed, and they talk about this cloud that follows them where they go. But when you really want to be effective with stress, you have to demystify it. And one of the ways to understand that all stress isn't equal is to look at the element of control. And that's where this whole pandemic thing is getting us, is because there's so much we don't have control over. There's so much of, now, granted, there are things we do, obviously. There's behaviors we can do, wearing masks, washing hands, social distancing. We've all heard those things. But there is an element that we don't have control. You know, that this thing, this stressor, is kind of like a silent threat that we always kind of know it's there. And I'll talk more about how that relates to things like regulatory fatigue. But you can also see where, you know, the COVID crisis has been traumatic for some folks. You know, it's interesting. I think on the macro level or on the societal level, there's no doubt that this has been a traumatic social experience from a collective standpoint. Alicia Zeman and I were talking about this not too long ago, our PBI's coordinator. But on the other side, at the micro level, or the individual level, I don't think it's fair to say that it's been traumatic for all individuals. I think that would be an overstatement and inefficient use of emotion. So what is trauma? So trauma is, in my opinion, anything that a significant event that disrupts your expected patterns. Okay, or if you look at this, is a more academic example or title here, but it's a significant event that disrupts your expected patterns. So it's something that happens that is so different than what you expected to happen that it throws you into another psychological place. I'll give you a very serious example of a young lady that I knew, and she was around 14 years old, and I was one of the folks that was there when we told her that her father had completed suicide. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is trauma. Like, this is real trauma. And think of it this way. It's hang with you on the metaphor. So you go down this road in life. So in life, you have these experiences. We'll talk about the brain being a pattern seeking device. But you have these experiences, and these experiences give you a level of predictability about the quote unquote the road of life that you're driving on. And then you observe other people's lives, and then you start to be able to predict into the future what that road, how that road might continue, like getting jobs, having kids, marriage, those kinds of things, you know, all that, retirement, whatever it might be. So you kind of predict that out into the future. Now, here's what happened with this young lady. At 14, she's been driving down this road where her dad was in her life. Her dad was there to take her to school, and he wasn't someone that was someone hospitalized all the time. He wasn't somebody that we would think of as quote unquote mentally ill. He was somebody who, you know, by my assessment, which was just outside looking in, seemed like someone who what we call dysthymic, which just has this constant kind of floating anxiety, depression kind of state, a lot of self-angst about where he was in life or whatever. But in her life, she's driving down this road, and then in that moment when she was told about this awful event, she had this psychological car wreck that was violent collision that threw her into this whole new reality and put her on this road that she'd never been on before, and she didn't know how to drive on it. And a lot of times in treatment, that's what we're trying to do with trauma, is we're trying to help the person navigate the world after the trauma. And that being the assumption, even if the trauma is over. But what you're trying to do is try to get the person to reintegrate into the world physically and psychologically after the trauma. So but it's scary because this was this extreme disruption. Now she doesn't know what to do in this world with all these new things. A lighter example, but a real one. And Christine and I were talking about this yesterday. I'm not trying to compare these two things. I'm just showing how trauma can present itself different ways. A good friend of mine's son, who is probably one of the better baseball players in our area, and last year was his senior year, and he's been lifting and running and really just working really hard and had some college interest and things like that. And when all this stuff shut down, he didn't play his senior year of baseball. He didn't graduate like everybody else. So here he was driving down this road, and everything up to that point would have told him there's no possible way you're not aside from injury. There's no possible way you're not going to play your senior year, and there's no possible way you're not going to put that cap and gown on and hug your friends and go to senior parties and all that kind of stuff. And then this collision, this coronavirus, this collision happens and thrusts him into this whole other reality. So I think it's important for us to understand that. Now, why do I say this isn't traumatic for everybody? Listen, I'll use myself as an example. It would be an overstatement. It'd be an emotional exaggeration for me to say this has been traumatic for my family. Has it been disruptive? Absolutely. But I work at a university where I was able to telework for as long as I needed to telework. I continued to get a paycheck. My wife is a principal. She continued to work. I mean, she worked. She still went to the building and had to do a lot of work at the building, taking care of a lot of things to support families and students. But she still got paychecks. My boys are 10, 13. They were fine at the house. Academically, they did as well as most kids did academically from March on. So I can't. It'd be an exaggeration to say it was traumatic for me. So, but now I'll tell you, I got a buddy of mine who's a barber, and it was traumatic for him because he didn't have a way to make a living. So the reason why I bring that up is I don't want. One of the mistakes I think we might make is when kids are returning is just making this assumption that all these kids are walking in the building traumatized. I think that'll be an inefficient use of emotion. I think there are kids going to be walking in the building have been traumatized, but we need to focus on those kids and not just think that everybody is this big ball of psychological debris. And I think that's true with your staff too. You're going to have some of your staff walk in and they're going to be on point and they're going to be ready to work and they're going to understand the risks they're going to be taking on. Then there's going to be some other folks that are going to walk in an emotional mess that are going to need more support and maybe need to process things personally a little more before they're ready to return professionally. So those are just things to think about. Not everybody's coming into this with that same experience. I do talk about toxic stress, and the reason we talk a lot about toxic stress is, and Bruce Perry calls the big T is trauma and little t is toxic stress. Toxic stress is different in the fact that it's that constant stress that's not necessarily traumatic, but it's exhausting. And a big part of this definition is that failure for the body to recover. And that's what you're really looking at is, let me give you an example. And all of you know this, a student who their life's exhausting. It's like, let's say it's a seventh grader. And it's not that somebody's being abused. It's more that he doesn't know who's going to pick him up from practice. He doesn't know where he's going to stay that week. Is he going to be at grandma's, or is he going to be at mom's, or is he going to be at dad's? And when he's at mom's, is mom's boyfriend going to be there because I really don't like him? And in school, am I going to be failing, or am I going to get in trouble? So their life is just exhausting. So toxic stress is an element that we're going to have kids coming in with more of a trauma type experience, and you're going to have some kids that it's just been exhausting to be at home, and they're actually going to be relieved to walk in the building. I know when I return to campus, I still do some stuff from home office as well now, but returning to campus gave me some structure again too, and that was an important part for me. So what both of these things, toxic stress and trauma, have in common is they do manifest anxiety. And anxiety, in a very simple explanation, is just fear of the unknown. It's what if. It's anxiety is when we can't predict the future. And here's why, because your brain is a pattern-seeking device. So its job is to, ever since you were a baby, your brain observed things observed patterns and used the observation of patterns to predict the future to keep you alive. Your brain's number one job is to keep you alive. So what it does is it tries to learn from the environment what it can do and what you need to do in order to stay alive. So it watches A plus B, and then I see C. Then I see A, then I see B, then I see C. So then in the future, I see A, I see B. Now I can prepare myself physically and emotionally for C. So that's really what the brain's doing all the time. And that's what we're doing, whether it's a kid learning primary colors or somebody at MIT studying quantum physics, all that is pattern recognition. What's an academic journal? It's a collection of studies that study pattern recognition to see if patterns are predictable or not predictable. I'll give you a real simple example. And if anybody's ever had a little toddler, you'd be sitting there eating dinner and the toddler's sitting there and they got their sippy cup and they take the sippy cup and they throw it on the floor or drop it on the floor. And of course you go over and you pick it up and you put it back on the counter, right? And if they're worth their salt, they go back, or you go back, you sit down, they take the sippy cup, they wait till you take a bite of food, and they drop it off the table again. And they look at you, right? You come back, you pick it up, you put it on the table. All they're doing is pattern testing. They're trying to solve the theoretical riddle of the falling sippy cup. That's what they're trying to figure out. So in that, when you start looking at, that's what they're doing is pattern recognition. Now let's take another example. Let's say though the kid drops the sippy cup, somebody comes and picks it up. They drop it a second time, and the person comes over and gets upset and throws the sippy cup in the sink and is all dysregulated and da-da-da-da-da. Well, now I'm anxious. Why am I anxious? Because I can't predict the pattern, because the pattern's inconsistent, because the adult is unstable. So that's why pattern recognition is so important. The one thing I do want to mention that you're probably going to have, you may have with some of your kids as they come back, is you might have some kids doing what I call brake checking. So brake checking is, let's say you needed to leave town and your car's broke down and you're in a big hurry and you go to Enterprise rent a car and you're like, listen, I need a car. And they're like, listen, we only got one car. Like, it doesn't matter. I need a car. I got to go. I got to get out of town because I got something I got to get to or a meeting or whatever. And they say, all right, here's the deal. We can give you this car. One small problem, it's not a big issue. The one small problem is this car, once, maybe every 100 times, when you hit the brake, it doesn't catch the first time, but you just got to pump the brake a little bit and it'll eventually catch. We haven't had anybody get hurt yet in it, so you should be fine. And let's say by chance you're like, you know what, okay, whatever, I've got to have this car. And you go and get in the car, and let's say you get off the Flatwood, you go from Flatwoods and you're jumping on the interstate, and I guarantee you the first thing you're going to start doing is start brake checking. Why? Because it might happen. Even if it's 1 out of 100, it might happen. And our brain really dials in on those kinds of things. So it kind of is anxious about that. So some of our kids who have experienced a lot of disruption and inconsistent patterns, there's a really good chance they're gonna brake check you, meaning they're going to challenge, they're going to see if you're stable, they're going to see if you're anxious. And we'll talk more about how important it is that we get to a good place with that. So this part of pattern recognition is when we create what's called internal working models about how the world works. And when the world doesn't work the way we think it should, then that causes regulatory fatigue. Now, what makes regulatory fatigue such a much more significant issue as we look at reentry? It's because we are engaging in a world that presents a higher level of neurological demand than the standard reentry. And I know you all know that. Let me give you an example. As far as going to the store, I'm a pretty efficient store goer. I'm pretty good at, I have a list. I know how I go. I know where I go. I know how to get in the line. I know how to check out. I've got my bags, all that kind of stuff. I'm pretty savvy at store going. But now in this pandemic context, let's say on a 100% scale, a store trip would have probably put me at like 30% neurological demand, because I'm pretty good at it. I've done it a bunch of times. The patterns are pretty predictable. I've got it under control. My skills are where they need to be with it. But now my neurological demand is probably like 60%. Why is it 60%? Because now when I go in, I've got to see, do they have sanitizing wipes? And I've got to touch this cart, and I got to wear a mask, and I've got to social distance, and I got to, when I'm touching things, I want to look thoughtful of everybody and not be, disruptive. When I'm waiting in line, I got to make sure that I'm standing on the stickers and all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it's more neurologically demanding to do what used to not be as demanding. So what that means is we only have so much mental energy in a day or in a moment even. And in a moment now, normal things, quote unquote, cost me more neurological energy, which means I have less neurological energy to be as engaged and capable as I typically would have been, if that makes sense. So everybody in your buildings is going to be less neurologically capable of dealing with the things that will be presented to them. And I hope a lot of what you're thinking right now is that's why learning isn't first things first. That's why algebra isn't first things first. We'll talk about what things will be. One thing I also want to mention is what environmental cues tell us, and just being thoughtful of what those environmental cues do. Listen, I understand the need for plexiglass barriers. We got them here at the university. But understand that there's a psychological underpinning. Understand when it comes to those, what a plexiglass barrier means. A plexiglass barrier is only in place because there's danger someplace or protection needed. And that's why it makes it a little more, it makes it different to interact with someone through plexiglass, because we're protecting ourselves from each other. But there's no mistaking the fact that there's a protection element. Again, that increases that neurological load on us and makes it more difficult. So that's going to make your hallways more difficult. That's going to make your cafeterias more difficult. That's going to make your buses more difficult. So everybody's coming into these situations with less neurological energy. And if we're not careful, as we continually get exposed to environments that overwhelm us, we can enter into a state of learned helplessness, which is my behavior doesn't matter. So that's the big story shift we've got to start having if we're going to reenter effectively, is finding places to focus our attention on where our behavior matters and what we can do versus what we can't do. You know, I've had to really cut back on social media and such as of late, and I watch a certain amount of news every day, and that's it. And the reason being is, even though the rates in Texas, the COVID rates in Texas have nothing to really do with me directly, it'll still affect me if I consume that content. And if all I do is consume content and the content is fed to me, then I'm at the mercy of the content and I'm not owning my own neurology. So I think that's one of these things where social media, where too much information can be too much. So these are things that we can kind of think about from an individual level. Now, let me get into some mistakes that this, my opinion, these are just my opinion, some things to think about some things we might avoid as we look at reentry. The first one is what I call the cake mistake. I have to excuse my hillbillyisms. It's just the way I think and talk. What is the cake mistake? The cake mistake is trying to make up for lost time, is looking at students as they enter the building as quote unquote behind. Now, I know a lot of kids are going to be academically behind. Everybody's going to be behind. So by that definition, then nobody's really behind because everybody's in the same place. Well, here's what I mean by that. Why I call it the cake mistake. If you have a cake that had to be cooked at 300 degrees for 30 minutes and you're running late, you can't cook that cake or bake that cake at 600 degrees for 15 minutes and expect it to turn out okay, because certain things need time and context to develop appropriately. And child development and child learning is one of those things. Relationships is one of those things. So the first things first for us is giving ourselves permission to, as administrators and as teachers, to understand that you can't get the 3 months back from last year. You just can't get it. So stop putting that unrealistic expectation on yourself. You know where you get them? You get them where they are. You accept where they are when they walk in that building, because we don't need an unrealistic expectation in an anxious and an anxiety-provoking regulatory fatigue context. That's why when I talk about first things first, I mean first things first. I don't mean it like wink, wink. No, we got to get in a hurry so we can get our test. I mean literally, if you try to accelerate, you'll do more harm than good. And we can talk more about that later if needed. Another mistake I want people to be thoughtful of is there is a need to process. I think our students are going to need to process a little bit about what's going on. I think our staff is going to need to process a little bit about what's going on, or a lot about what's going on. And what is processing? It's trying to understand the new patterns. Processing is what I call map making. So if I'm lost, what processing allows me to do is to check my surroundings, to reorient myself. So that's what processing does in groups. We check with our surroundings or the people with us to see if, well, they're feeling the same way I'm feeling, or they're feeling the same way I'm feeling. Okay, I have a sense that where I'm at is a more reasonable place. So that's why processing is so important. Now here's the skill side, and this will push you as a leader. Even the best leaders are going to have trouble with this, and the best teachers are going to have trouble with this. Is admiring versus solving problems. Now, my opinion, when you meet with your staff, this would be one of the things that I would discuss on the front end, which would be, listen, gang, I want to make sure we have an opportunity to process what's going on, but we always have to we have to keep each other focused, because we always are processing towards problem solving, not complaining towards excuses. And I think that's but if you say it on the front end, when it starts to happen, then hopefully the group starts to course correct, and you can course correct, and it doesn't have to be such a got ya moment for everybody. Excuse me. So one of the things I want us to really think hard about is it'll challenge every bit of your leadership to make sure that we're processing towards problem solving. And the way you can tell is that the processing is about gaining a better understanding of context in order to build better strategies. Complaining for excuses is really just feels like you're on an emotional treadmill, and it's exhausting. So those are those things we start to look at. Now, with all that being said, and this is one of the things I feel very strongly about, and I don't want to sound harsh, but I do want to be direct, is I think another thing when we're talking about us and we're talking with our staff is that we understand that there's absolutely zero tolerance for what I call fighting in front of the kids. And the example is, let's say you have a divorced couple. There's no excuse for, let's say, the dad to complain to the kids about his ex-wife, because that is a selfish expression, an immature, selfish expression of the dad using the children as for processing selfishly, but the kid can't do anything about it. So the worst thing you can do to a person is give them harmful information that they can't change. So this is why, when I say don't fight in front of the kids, I think we have to be very thoughtful about teachers being able to process with students, but not standing up in front of a group of kids saying, we shouldn't be here, this is dangerous, and you need to do this and you need to do that, because what they're doing is they're grandstanding for their own selfish needs, and then putting that burden on children. I'm not telling people that you can't process, but when we have kids asking the question, can these adults protect me? If they're fighting amongst themselves, it makes that protection a real question. So this is one of those things that I think we say on the front end to folks. And if you have teachers that struggle with their own self-regulation, these might be some of those people that you might seek out in a thoughtful way, and talk to them about how they're feeling about reentry, and make sure that they also, and I'm not saying you have to single people out. I think you talk to all your staff about it first, and then you find maybe some staff that might need some specific support because they struggle with boundaries with students. It's just something to think about. Another mistake I think we have to avoid is doing too much or trying to do all this special COVID stuff. And I don't mean that from health procedures. I mean that by programs. Like, we need a trauma and COVID program and this program and that program. No. I would say, it's an old military adage, which is you don't rise to the level of your expectations, you fall to the level of your training. What that means is back to basics. Back to basics. This is Vince Lombardi. The picture is Vince Lombardi, and he was a coach in the NFL. And one of the things that he talked about is he had this one play called the Lombardi sweep, and he spent so much time. So one time at a coach's clinic, they said he talked about it for 2.5 hours, one play. And he just talked about how if you run this play well, you could be successful. And I think that's what you have to do as leaders in your buildings, is go, what are the things we need to do really well? Not all the stuff we need to do, because here's the reality. You can't hire or purchase your way out of inefficient systems. You've got to get back to the basics. You've got to figure out things like, and I'll talk about reconnection, reteaching, and reinforcement, and I'll unpack each one of those as we go. We've got to get those things. It's not about buying a bunch of stuff. It's really about, because here's what's going to happen. And I talk about this all the time. You'll see weaknesses in systems, like you see when pressure is on the line, you find your leaks. So if I'm a central office employee right now, I'm going to really be thoughtful about which schools are struggling from a culture and climate perspective, and I'm going to make sure I get those administrators lots of support, because they're going to be the folks that struggle most with reentry, especially, and I don't know any of the principals, so I'm not speaking to anybody directly, especially a principal that struggled to lead and was probably easier to walk on. They're going to have a really hard time going back. Overly demeaning people are going to have a really hard time going back. Teachers that struggle with classroom management or were emotionally fragile, they're going to have a really hard time going back. So those are those people that when the pressure gets on the line, they're going to have a harder time. So what can we do about it? How do we work into this? This is just kind of and I would use this slide long before COVID to talk about, what do we do to decrease regulatory fatigue and increase capacity? So I just told you about how everything's going to require more from people. So what do we do to help with that? And we're going to talk about things like leadership, environmental design, expectations, teaching and rehearsal, and those kinds of things. The first part, and that's why I really appreciate that we're talking to you guys as administrators, is it's leadership first. Power of the pack. We're pack animals, or however, social creatures, whatever makes you more comfortable. But the biggest thing we know about social creatures and pack animals is they have to have leadership. If there's a lack of leadership, it creates anxiety within the group, and the anxiety within the group, and then people then position themselves for leadership, and so one of the big things is, this is for you as administrators, this is game day. This is when you step in, step up. And if you look at the people that we admire the most, I'll speak from American history directly, are people who all were leaders during some of the most challenging times in American history. You look at why is Abraham Lincoln looked at the way he is. It's because of the Civil War. Why was FDR viewed the way he is? Because of the Depression. Why was Martin Luther King Jr. viewed the way he is? Because of the way he is. It's because of the Civil Rights Movement. As a leader, you can be afraid, or you can step up, and you can say, and it doesn't mean that you're grandiose and delusional. But the reason being is because, and this is one of the big things, this is also a military saying, calm is contagious and chaos is too. That you got to get your ducks in a row if you're going to help everybody else get their ducks in a row. And what does having your ducks in a row mean from a leadership perspective? It means, what's confidence? Confidence is the belief that you've done all the work you can do to be as prepared as you can be. Confidence is that you truly have a plan with the information that you have, but you also understand that there's things you don't know, but you've tried your best to be in the best position you can be in. And like I said, I have unbelievable admiration for educational leaders, because you've had to make decisions based on the information you have, knowing it's not all the information you need, and also knowing the decision you make today could expire next week because the context is different. But it's that confidence of, I'm doing the best I can with the information I have. And the second part of that leadership equation is holding frame. What does that mean? That means, how easy is it for you to be knocked off your quote unquote emotional horse? What does it take for you to escalate or be angry or frustrated? You can still be those things, but how easy is it? Because what happens is, if you're unstable, then again, the leadership structure for the whole group becomes unstable. And then what can also happen is a disruptive person can then take leadership in the group. That's like that, I almost was a little bit rude in how I said it. That really loud but ill-informed person can take leadership if there's a vacuum where the appropriate leader should be. So another point I would mention to you that's probably from a focus standpoint is really working yourself on controlling your controllables. Really focusing on, what am I going to do when kids step foot in this building? Understanding that there's a lot of things you don't have control over. There's tons of things you don't have control over. The color matrix you don't have control over directly, meaning you don't get to decide what it is. What the president is deciding about hydroxychloroquine or whatever it is, it's really not your controllable. And the more energy you spend on that is less energy you're spending on the things that you do have control over. So what we do in the TA center is we focus heavily. You guys know, because you get federal funds, I have to show you a pyramid or a triangle. So here's our triangle. We actually love our triangle. We love the PBIS multi-tiered system of support in West Virginia. Right now, of course, we know that there's a lot of conversation around the WVTSS, which is West Virginia Tiered System of Support, which is just West Virginia's version of multi-tiered system of support. It's talking about what things we do for all, some, and few, and you've all seen it before. It's called, but one of the big elements I want you to think about as a leader is how strong is your team? How strong is your leadership team? I do think schools who have strong leadership teams, and I'll speak specifically to some of our projects, schools that we've had that have been implementing PBIS effectively, those schools are going to have an easier time at reentry. And the reason I believe that to be the case is because they already have a problem-solving team, and all you do with that problem-solving team is you insert problem-solving team works on it, produce strategies and solutions. If you struggled with a leadership team, then the focus isn't there and the efficiency isn't there. And why is that so important? I heard one time, and this statistic may not be exactly true, but that's not the point. What I want to mention is the importance of revision. I heard a while back that when you write a behavior plan, and I've done, it's one of the things I've historically done a lot of, is when you write a behavior plan that the first draft, only 33% of it will be effective. And that was a shock for me, and partly because when I first started doing behavior planning, I was a mental health professional and working with schools with kids with mental health problems and helping with behavior plans and FBAs and things like that. I just thought in my head, as ignorant as it sounds, that I was going to write these beautiful behavior plans, and they would be like, just so organized, and this ABC analysis, and I was going to walk into an IEP meeting, and I'd put it on the table, and a light would shine in through the window, and everybody would implement it with smiles on their face, and the kids' ADHD would magically disappear. Obviously I'm joking with some of that, but I did believe the first draft was the draft. Here's what I've learned, and here's what this number tells us, is your first draft is going to be mostly wrong. What does that mean? So it's not, I've learned now, it's not the first draft that makes a good plan. It's the team's ability to revise the plan. That's what makes good plans, is the effective and efficient nature in which plans can be revised and improved. So I think it's fair to say, and with any superintendent, and hopefully Kathy wouldn't disagree with me on this one, but I don't think any superintendent in the state knows that they have the perfect plan that accounts for all variables, that there's nothing that could happen to disrupt their plan. So the more realistic expectation is, have we written the best plan we can write and have a team that can revise it as effective and efficiently as possible? The same thing goes in your building. Have you written the best plan you can write, knowing what you know, but do you have faith that you have a team that can work from that 33% and continue to move forward? Because here's where it's toxic if we don't have a good team, or if you don't have good culture. Then we write the first plan, and then the first thing that goes wrong, if we don't have a good culture, then people go, see, I told you, it's their fault, and they didn't do it right, and I told them it was going to fail. That's where that negativity and that toxicity then stifles the plan itself. So that's what we have to really be thoughtful of, is that's why teaming, in my mind, is probably one of the most important elements as we look at reentry. Now, let's go to some three things I want to get through, and then to talk about how to prioritize. So teaming, we know, is a systematic change we need to do. We talked about the mistakes. We talked about compassion through understanding how the COVID's affected people. Now let's get to where the rubber meets the road. First, priority 1A is reconnecting with students, period. That's number one thing we've got to be doing, is we've got to focus on what does reconnection look like. And I'm not telling you that it's all well, we're going to be nice kids when they get there and we miss them. No. How will you plan for reconnection as you would plan for a topic that you're going to be tested on? How are you going to create accountability measures and systems that make reconnection, that show that reconnection is a priority? Why is this so important? If we look at resiliency research, one of the main things we know that builds resilience in an individual, their ability to bounce back from traumatic experiences or difficult experiences, one of the main things that is an indicator of that is the depth of their social networks. It's their relationships. So you want to help kids get better, you deepen their social networks. That's why this is 1A. Especially another side of that is we know that learning and growth takes place in the context of relationships. So if we want learning to recommence, if we want learning to start back again, we have to create those relationships first. An example I've given 1,000 times, but I think it still applies. If you remember, like if you had kids when they were little, like maybe like one-ish, and they were learning to walk and they were kind of cruising, right? And you would get just far enough away from them, right? You put your hand out and you wiggle your fingers, and what you're trying to do is get them to step away from the couch. Now, that's a really developmentally important situation. Here's why. When they're holding the couch is doing the job. The couch is keeping them safe. What you're asking them to do is take a risk, and that's what developmental change and growth is. That's what learning is. It's taking a risk. If we want kids to re-enter into a learning relationship with us, we have to reconnect and create an environment where they're willing to take risk. And I've seen this even pre-COVID, all this kind of stuff, where I've had kids that the academic isn't the variable. But what happens is they'll go in one teacher's room, put their head down and sleep the whole time, go to another teacher's room and work their butt off. Why? Because they'll take risks for that person. So we've got to understand that it doesn't matter if you teach kindergarten or AP English, relationships is priority 1A. You know, we've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, everybody's seen it 1,000 times. Probably one of the most useful psychological theories of all time. I've summarized it and named it after myself to make my mom proud. 2 levels. You can summarize Maslow's 5 to 2. And here's 2 things that kids are going to need to know with the relationships that you're creating. Are they safe? Do they matter? Safety means the environment's predictable, consistent, and caring. Significance, or whether they matter, means they add value to your life and you add value to their life. And we'll talk about those things. One of the ways you can operationalize this is look at your activities as a building, look at your routines, and figure out where do you embed positive experiences. You know, one of the examples I give is a middle school I worked with, and these folks were trying to get better. And when I went in, you know, one of the things I noticed was there was a very us versus them mentality between the staff and the students. The staff had a very collective narrative of what's wrong with kids these days. And the kids had a strong sense of that. So it was us versus them. And one of the things we did was you started observing relationship patterns in the building. And I'll give you an example. One of the ones that we observed, entry in the morning, the kids were coming in. And all I did was a very simple T-chart. I made a T-chart. On one side, I put DC, which is direction or correction. On the other side, I put a plus sign. And every time a student was directed or corrected, I put a mark on the DC side. Every time a student was positively acknowledged, I put a mark on the plus side. Now, positive acknowledgement, by my definition, is very low standard. That just means you acknowledge that kid's alive. Hey, good to see you this morning. Hey, how was your weekend? How did your game go last night? I like your shirt. That's all it has to be. First observation, the ratio is 12 to 1. A student was 12 times more likely to be directed or corrected versus be positively acknowledged. So what we worked on was, one, helping people understand, in defense of the staff, helping people understand that duty, like duty at lunch, duty in the hallways, duty at arrival, is not about being a prison guard whose job it is to correct misbehavior. Duty is an opportunity to connect and support students while upholding the behavioral standard of the building. That's a shift for some folks, because a lot of people just walk around with their hands behind their back looking for kids to mess up. So we gave people a better definition of what duty is. And then we talked about ways to, because some people, they needed more help with this, how to engage students in a genuine, not fake, a genuine positive manner. Now, I do think you're going to have a hard time. This is going to be something that we're going to have to be thinking of, because people are going to be thinking about things like masks and touching or hugging and hand sanitizer and all this kind of stuff. You're going to have to make a huge effort to make sure that we're having these positive communication. And you know what? Some of our staff might need scripts. Some of our staff might need support. I also think this is going to create some challenges from a relationship standpoint, explaining to, and I know this, especially those of you in the elementary ages where you got kids who are used to hugging and things like that. You've got to help people know what to say. Like, for example, we can't do this, but we can do this, and talk about doing air fives or, touching, kicking feet together, whatever. But I think letting kids participate in that conversation is going to be important. Why? Because it shows that I care so much about our relationship and I care so much about your safety. Let's figure out a way that we can continue to keep both of those things in place. Helping people do that is going to be critically important, I think, because I've already had a lot of teachers say, about how hard that's going to be. It's okay to say that to kids too. It's okay to say that to staff. We had new folks come for orientation here the other day, and it's so weird for me not to shake hands with people. So I just say it. Listen, it's so weird for me not to shake hands with you. But I want to make sure we're keeping everybody safe. Fantastic to meet you. Get those things out there. Do that with kids. Kids get it. Kids understand. And then that creates that modeling for that. So finding those places, write those schedules. If you're an administrator, you've got to approach this in a structured and systematic way, not in the, hey, let's make sure our kids know we love them. Listen, that sounds nice, but we got to do the work. We got to create the structure. We got to make sure that we're building these deep social networks to facilitate or deepen their experiences. These are just some things we typically talk about when we take deepening social networks. One I do want to pull out on this. I've got a lot of folks we've talked to, and our TA staff were talking about this the other day. One of the big things for me is I hear a lot of people say, I'm worried about my kids. And I get it. We have some people that they haven't heard from kids since March, and it's the kid that they're most worried about. And one of the things I want you to think about is, I know we're worried about kids, and we're worried about kids as they come back in. But one of the things I'd ask you to consider is, how do we worry effectively? How do we worry with focus? How do we, like, for example, when you're meeting with your staff and your grade levels are meeting, let's think about which kids might need a little extra when they get here. Let's think about, one of the examples I'll use is, let's find Billy before Billy finds us. Let's not wait until Billy has his meltdown that we know is coming. Let's think about which kids are coming in, and not just the standard behavior disruption type stuff, but who are those kids that with anxiety and disruption, and they might have had issues with food, or the people they're in their home with are toxic, and so on and so forth. What are you doing to, and I'm not saying you need to do a screening process as in like implementing it, because I just told you to keep it simple, but your staff knows how to care for kids, and they know how to be concerned for kids. But let's give them a system to care for kids. Let's identify who might need check-in, check-out, who might need some mentoring, who are those kids that might need that little bit of extra support, a little bit of extra attention. So let's find Billy before Billy finds us. Let's worry effectively, as opposed to having this ambiguous, I'm worried about my babies kind of thing. So that's going to be more effective. Second big thing is a priority. Reconnections 1, reteachings 2. Let's teach kids what it means to be successful in our buildings. Let's really think about what behavioral success looks like in our buildings. I know you guys have been doing this. I know you've been thinking about it. I know you're preparing. I know my wife, like I said, is a principal, and she hours upon hours upon hours developing their physical reentry plan, talking about social distancing, talking about specific activities. And one of the things she's done, I'm biased because she's my wife, but one of the things that she did is she took that whole plan and she posted it on their school Facebook page, so that way parents could flip through it and parents could see the work that's being put in to keep their kids safe, and gotten a lot of positive information. Now they may go back to school. The plan for our district, I live in Chesapeake, Ohio, which is right across the river from Huntington, and their plan is to go full-time 5 days. And that plan may fall through in 2 weeks, but I think it said something to the parents in the community that the staff at my wife's school took the time to build the best plan possible. And part of that best plan possible is talking about what it means for students to be successful in our buildings behaviorally. The first place that starts is environmental design. We've got to really get in our buildings and figure out how can we create an environment as an extension of instruction. We've all seen this. We've seen the stickers on the floor. We've seen the signs. Listen, that stuff's important. It's critical. Again, we mentioned that the environment is now going to require more of a neurological load. And what visuals do is they decrease some of the neurological load because the environment takes on some of that burden. So that's why your environmental design stuff is huge. If you're a principal that's not your bag, you got to find somebody who it is. You got to find somebody that's going to help you, who's creative that way. Maybe in your building you've got a Pinterest ninja, someone who's really good with Cricut and vinyls and blah, 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 blah. Or maybe you guys can get stuff from your vocational school to do some of that. Or let's say you've got another great resource, might be Anybody that's worked with in special education, that's worked with kids with autism and understands the importance of visuals. Another great resource could be your early childhood teachers, because they understand the importance of visuals. These are those things, these are those people where visuals are going to be really important, because they decrease the unknown, because anxiety is fear of the unknown, and what visuals do is decrease the unknown. And this people, you might be saying, oh, but Jim, I'm the principal of the high school. Doesn't matter. Kids need it at high school. Kids need visual cues in high school. I think every teacher needs to be very focused on schedules in the beginning when kids get back, going over the schedules, even if it's the exact same as it's always been. We need to be teaching, reteaching our schedules. We need to be going through them. Why? It just gives those kids just that little morsel of certainty about what's my day going to be like. I remember one time I had an AP English teacher come up to me and she goes, "You mean to tell me," and this is back before the pandemic, and she goes, "You mean to tell me that I teach AP English? I've got the best and brightest students in my class, and I should review my schedule before I teach every day?" And I said, "Yes, you should." And she goes, "Well, that just seems like I'm babying them." And I'm like, "Let me ask you this. How many times have you had kids walk in the classroom and one of the first things they ask you is, 'What are we doing today?'" She goes, "Well, they ask me that all the time." And I'm like, "Well, which would you rather them be using their mental energy on? Solving the riddle of the schedule of the day, or focusing on AP English?" And I didn't mean to be dismissive or rude about it, but it's this thing where, like, if you go to a training, you want to see an agenda. Why? Because you want to know what the day's going to be like. So why in every one of our classrooms are we not reviewing, especially now because anxiety's high, why are we not reviewing our schedules? I'm not saying we got to have visual schedules for all kids all the way up. I'd like them. I think they can be very effective. But using things like timers, using visuals to really help decrease the uncertainty and increase the certainty in our building. Understanding that this word can get us in a lot of trouble. Kids should know how to walk the hallway. Kids should know how to wash their hands. Kids should know how. Listen, let's assume that all kids have educational and hygiene amnesia when they walk in our buildings. Let's reteach it all. It's not hurt anybody. You know, one of my favorite examples of this is what the military does. When you arrive with the military, they don't care where you're from. They don't care your parents were. They don't care how much money you have or had. They'll teach you how to stand, how to speak, how to walk, how to take care of your stuff, all that stuff. Why? Because it's inefficient for them to make all these assumptions, because then they have to go back and correct the assumptions and shame people and blah, 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 blah. It's better just to assume everybody needs to be taught. Everybody needs to know. So we got to focus in on, what do you want from me? And one of the ways that you can do this, if you've got some PD time coming up, and I don't know what your schedule is for PD, but I'll just mention this. This is something I've done with schools before for fall anyways, and it is do a setting analysis activity. And the setting analysis activity is where what we've done, and I know with social distancing it might be a little more difficult, but you could do it even virtually, is we would take like the Post-it paper and write different environments on the top. Oh, here, I'll show you. Different environments on the top, and then we make 4 quadrants. And in one quadrant it says, what do we want? The other one, what works? The other one, inconsistencies, and the other one is challenges. So what we want is what it would mean for kids to be successful in that environment. What works? What are the things that are helping kids be successful in that environment? Inconsistencies, what are things we aren't consistent as adults in implementing consistently? Challenges, what are things that we can't change but we have to take into account? For example, like we've done some work at Lost Creek Elementary in Harrison County. Well, Lost Creek Elementary's building is 100 years old. That's a challenge, and they can't change that, but it's a challenge that they had to account for. So when we did this activity, and anybody can do that, we did this activity, I'll pull out a few things that happened. So what this does is organize in order to do, and positive behavior support, often a lot of it is environmental change and skill development. So this gave us environmental change ideas and skill development. So let me pull a few of them out of here. Like one of them was supervision patterns. Benches, extra benches in the field area. What that was is teachers, it was a big playground, and there was only one bench in the upper right hand corner. So teachers on duty would all sit on that bench, and we were trying to figure out, gosh, we need more dispersed supervision. But the problem was that if you were supervising the back left corner, you're basically just standing by the fence by yourself in the grass. So what we did was we approached Knights of Columbus in their area. Knights of Columbus donated big, nice benches, and put them in at different places on the playground and gave the teacher some place to sit. That's fair. That's fair. I don't think they should have to just stand by themselves in a corner. Let's make that supervision as enjoyable as possible. That was one of the things we did. An inconsistency, and this is the one the principal jumped on real quickly, is not everyone was using walkie-talkies. And the principal's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. If we have communication problems, we have safety problems, and we will not have safety problems in this building. So they got on everybody, the expectation, they did radio checks, make sure everybody's using them. And so what this does is it formalizes and organizes some things you can do to start. And I would argue that with COVID being an activity like this can be very, very helpful. And it also, big part, gives your staff the opportunity to be a part of problem solving, gives them an opportunity to be a part of a solution and not just complaining and things like that. So this is a PBS thing that we do. And listen, I'm not going to take you through a whole PBS Academy idea, but we have found, and the evidence supports, that 3 to 5 positively stated expectations for all people in all environments is much easier to teach and generalize. So if those of you who aren't familiar with PBIS and with Fidelity, would be, we might have a school. A more classic example would be safe, be respectful, be responsible. So then what you do is you generalize and teach what it means to be safe, respectful, and responsible. For example, what does it mean to be safe in the hallway? What does it mean to be respectful in the hallway? What does it mean to be responsible in the hallway? What does it mean to be safe on the playground, respectful on the playground, responsible on the playground? So you have these overarching expectations, and then you fit the procedures and guidelines underneath those expectations. And what I've seen, and what I believe to be the case, is I think schools that are already existing with this kind of structure are going to have an easier time with reentry, because they'll be able to plug their teaching systems into their existing positive behavior support structure or behavior support system structure. They won't have to, and those schools that depended more so on exclusionary practices and things like that, they're going to have a harder time. So here's just an example of a school I worked with up in Randolph County. Put safety first, act respectfully, work responsibly, strive to do your best. Just an example. There's all kinds of things in this, but I wouldn't, it's hard, you couldn't install something like this easily before school, but keeping your message clear and simple is really important. Practicing in context, that's a big thing. We look at teaching systems. Do you have practice scheduled? Not just, back, the first day of school kind of stuff, but do you have set up where kids can be with adults, where they can be taught, where they can, the expectations or the procedures can be explained? I think that's important, especially for your middle school, high school kids and your elementary. Can things be explained to help them understand why we're doing certain procedures, things like that? I think that's really critical that we practice in context. And also a big thing, involving your support staff, involving your bus drivers, involving your kitchen staff, involving your secretaries, involving your teaching assistants. Make them a part of your teaching systems, again, because they're participating in that. So identifying these areas, when to teach, how to teach, and whether we know if the teaching is working, like we know how to do in education. Now, you might have some kids, and this is something about, like what I mentioned before, is how do we find Billy before Billy finds us? Be thinking about which kids might need targeted teaching sessions. Could be your kids with regulatory issues, your kids with autism, anxiety, ADHD, or ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, kids that historically have struggled. Finding those kids who might need smaller group instruction. Maybe even some of our kids might need social stories. They might need video rehearsal. Really focusing on some of these kids, which kids might need visual cues or auditory cues. Like, for example, we know the happy birthday song with washing your hands and things like that. Are you thinking about, just like you would do academically, what are those support strategies that those kids might need? Last but certainly not least is going to be we talked about reconnection, reteaching. Now we're going to talk about reinforcement. Reinforcement is these feedback and acknowledgement systems. How do we make sure kids know that if something's important enough to teach, important enough to punish, it's important enough to acknowledge? How do we get kids feedback that they're meeting our expectations so they start to feel effective in the environment? Now, let me say this as a caveat real quick. We always teach before we reinforce, because if you try to reinforce when a kid has low skill level, you'll actually frustrate them. Let me give you an example. If you gave me a physics problem, which I took it a long time ago, but and it's one that I've not been taught on, and
and I really don't understand even how to work on it. If you gave me a physics problem, you say, Jim will give you $1,000 to finish his physics problem. All that $1,000 does, which is an incentive, is frustrate me because I would want it, but I don't have the skills to do the physics problem. So one of the things that I always want people to think about is skill before motivation. So always teach before you try to reinforce. Now, you teach me how to do the physics problem and give me a similar problem. Now I'm motivated by the 1,000 because now I have the skill and I have the motivation. So I think that's a real important thing to think about is there's not a real place for reinforcement is a part of the teaching system, but it follows the teaching system. So saying to kids like, hey man, I appreciate you being safe in the hallway. Hey, but the mistake we hear with reinforcement is, and this is the biggest thing we fight with PBIS, is people thinking, oh, well, reinforcement, oh, you're talking about parties and hot and ready pizzas and things like that. And, not to get on my soapbox too much about it, but I think one of the mistakes we run into with schools trying to implement some sort of behavior system is it's a lot of times people think of, oh, well, if everybody that's good gets a reward at the end of the 9 weeks. And actually, those aren't highly effective. And the reason why they're not highly effective is usually the kids that make it to the end of the grading period with no infractions are the kids who would have made it to the end of the grading period with no infractions anyways. So you really just kind of reward the kids who would have done it anyways. What we find from really effective behavioral feedback is your shorter intervals are much better. Your daily and weekly intervals, so return on behavior is much, much better. So we might need to really be thinking about as a staff is how do we make sure, again, like I mentioned earlier in relationships, how we get kids that positive feedback versus direction correction, meaning sometimes we're going to have to force ourselves. I give you an example of the teacher it was a great example. She was a good person, but she struggled with positive feedback. So one of the things she did, and this is just an awesome example, is she would set a timer at the beginning of the course, beginning of class, and she would put 10 beans in her right pocket. And she's just not naturally a very positive person. She's a good teacher, but she was kind of grumpy and a nice lady though. So what she would do is she'd have to make herself give positive feedback to students. And every time she would give a positive feedback that had to be genuine because she didn't want to be fake, is she would move a bean from her right pocket to her left pocket. And her goal with class was to move 10 beans from her right pocket to her left pocket, getting herself used to providing positive feedback. And I remember I saw her before she retired, and she said, Jim, I don't need my beans anymore. And what she meant by that was it had become more the way she just did her work was to provide that feedback. And some of our folks are going to need that support to give kids feedback when they're meeting our expectations, because if you want kids to have those safe behaviors, want the kids to meet your expectations, they got to know when they're meeting them. And it's not always about stuff. We talk about no-cost, pro-social, short intervals. So no-cost things are things that don't cost anything. It's not about school stores and treasure boxes. It's about what are things we can offer that are meaningful, but also realistic. And ideally, we love things to be pro-social. We have found as far as reinforcers, if you want to read some neat stuff about reinforcement, Chapman's book on the love languages is a really cool way to think about how different people are reinforced by different things. But one of the things we look at is, especially in our K-5 group, not all, but a lot of your K-5 kids, their highest reinforcer is time with adults. They love eating lunch with the teacher. They love doing special things with the teacher, playing a game with the teacher, those kinds of things. Your 6-12 kids, and I'd say that 5 to 6, 5-6 can go either way. The 6-12 kids, they want time with their peers. That's their higher reinforcer because the social integration is such a big thing. And short interval is let's try to get that feedback quick. And this is something you can talk about as a staff. How are we going to shorten our intervals? How are we going to make that a part of duty? How are we going to make that a part of class? How are we going to make pro-social things in a place where you can't really be that social? You have to be 6 people or 6 feet apart, stuff like that. But the real important part, and this is as an administrator, you need to be thinking about how are you going to give feedback to your staff to reinforce what they're doing, to give them a sense is the power of reinforcement is this development of what we call rational optimism, or what ACOR calls rational optimism. Which rational optimism is not about whether you view the glass as half empty or half full. Rational optimism is the belief or the concept of where do I get more water? It's not whether I'm observing it as half empty or half full. It's where do I believe that my effort changes the outcome? Do I believe that my behavior matters? And in a situation in a pandemic where anxiety is the predominant emotion, and anxiety being based off fear of the unknown, what rational optimism does is it gives us a sense of control back that's rational. There are things I can do. My behavior does matter. The things that I'm doing are being noticed by other people. I think that's a really important idea for your staff, that you've got to consciously do for your staff, and your staff has to consciously do for your students. And it seems this is somewhat joking, but I'm really serious about this. If you've ever seen the movie Dumb and Dumber, and if you haven't, oh my gosh, you got to do that immediately this weekend. At the end of the movie, when Lloyd Christmas has been following Mary Swanson around the whole time, and he finally meets up with her in the end of the movie, and he professes his love to her, and he looks at her and he goes, "Give it to me straight, Mary. What's the chances we're going to end up together?" And Mary Swanson looks at him and says, "Not good." And then Lloyd Christmas looks back at her and says, "Well, like 1 in 100?" And then Mary Swanson looks at him and says, "More like 1 in a million." And he looks at her and he says, "So you're telling me there's a chance?" And I just love that. I call it Lloyd's theory. I just love that psychology. It's not about being ignorant and all that. I know the movie's called Dumb and Dumber, but it's that belief that your behavior matters is what we're trying to. That's what we got to come into reentry with. And I said this earlier, and I want to be more specific. When you make the decision to return, you got to come back 100%. You got to come back dialed in. You got to come back ready to do the work. And I know you all are there. I'm just saying, like, that's the mentality. If we're coming in 1 foot in and 1 foot out, it will create a more anxiety-provoking environment. And I'm not telling you people shouldn't be afraid and people shouldn't be anxious. My wife is aware of those risks that she's taking when she returns. But we decided as a family, because it's our personal decision, that she was going to return. We decided as a family that I was going to return to work. That is people's personal decisions. But when she crosses the threshold of that building, she returns to the responsibility of being the principal of that building, 100%, not kinda. And when I step foot on this campus, I return to my responsibility as the associate director of the Autism Training Center. And when a teacher steps in a classroom, they return to the responsibility of being responsible for those young people. Not an easy decision, but a decision that we have to make, each one of us have to make. And keeping that focus of the idea of what do kids need these days? What do kids need from us in a time that's unprecedented? What do kids need from us as leaders? What do your staff need from you as a leader? Making sure that we're processing for problem solving and not complaining for excuses, and working through that 33%, understanding that it's going to require a lot of patience on everybody's behalf, from the superintendent to bus drivers to teachers to principals. The effectiveness of our ability to deal with this uncertainty is our ability to collaborate and solve problems. That's where it's going to be. Our ability to collaborate and solve problems, our ability to take an imperfect plan, because there's no perfect plan, to take our imperfect plans and try to make them as best we can with the information that we have. So there's my contact information. That's how you reach listen, I'll tell you, I said this before. I think in Braxton County, we have a behavior support specialist is Aaron Day, and our Alicia Zeman's up in Harrison County. She's our PBIS coordinator. And, we also on the Autism Training Center can provide a lot of support for your individuals with students with autism. But, let us help you. It's game day for us. We're accepting the responsibility of our role and want to help you any way we can. So hopefully my goal is that some of the content that we've had, at least, maybe validated some of the things you're already thinking or got you thinking about some other things. And again, let me say very, very clearly, I am not presenting myself as I haven't figured this all out. I'm just sharing my understanding the best that I can with the information that I know. And I hope somehow that that's helpful to you.
For more information regarding the West Virginia PBIS project, you can go to www.wvpbis.org. For more information regarding the West Virginia Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center, you can go to www.marshall.edu/BMHTAC. For the most current information regarding the West Virginia Department of Education's response to the COVID-19 crisis, you can go to www.wvde.us/COVID-19. This site also has resources for families as well as educators.